Okay, I think I've got everything going here now. Holy moly. Oh, there's always so many things. Okay, I guess we talked about that. Okay, so holy moly, yeah. One of the things with streaming stuff online is it adds a layer of complexity to just everything I do, which I don't mind, but it's definitely one of those slightly challenging things. Okay. Oh, all right, I'm good. Never, ever am I letting myself have two classes back to back again. Ever. So hard to make it between places. All right, so last time, I guess I should say a couple of things. So tomorrow, from about 2 p.m.-ish until, I'm just turning some things off. There we go. From about 2 p.m. until about 4, I will be in my office. So if you want to come and take a look at your exam, do feel free to do that. You don't need an appointment. You can just come on by if you like. Office is over in Torrey, first floor, 1-062D. So I'm inside the Center for Criminological Research, and they've got offices against the east-facing wall of the building. So if you come, you can come chat, and if you want to look over your exam, I can do that with you. So that is thing one. Thing two, Friday as well. I will be around from around 2 to around 4 in my office if you want to come see. And then next week, I know next week is reading week, so probably none of you want to be on campus if you don't have to be. But Friday, I'm going to be around pretty much the whole day. So I'm going to come in at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'll stay till like 3:30. Yeah, stay till about 3:30. So if you want to come on Friday of next week, you can do that. I'll send out an announcement to that effect so that you remember. If you don't, if you didn't catch what I said. Okay, so can I clarify what Sigmund Freud's belief was? Okay, let me go back a few slides to Freud. Okay, so Freud. Essentially, Freud, like a lot of our other theorists, if you want to kind of distill it down to what's really important for the purposes of the course, social interaction is what helps the self emerge, right? So I guess if we were to pin down Freud in kind of really, really simple terms, there is no kind of, there is no pre-existing self, right? The self doesn't exist at birth. It has to emerge later. And it emerges from your interaction with others, right? The emergence is in interaction with the others. So as you are going through your life and you're interacting with your mom, your dad, your friends, your brothers and sisters, your aunts and uncles, and all of those things, your self, right? Your identity, your way of being in the world emerges, right? So you learn, and through all this, Freud's other big thing is the key in socialization is learning self-control, sublimating urges, and that's all learned basically in this kind of context of being punished for doing bad things, of being, praised for doing good things. I hope that helps. Okay, let's move forward. So we ended off on this slide, right, talking about, and we'll go to the next slide, which sort of ties into this. So who you are, right? Your potential, what you could possibly believe, your ability to understand, concepts, ways of being in the world, and all of this stuff is deeply shaped by the time and place that you live. And even our kind of basic concepts about who we are and what our kind of role in life is at distinctive phases ultimately is shaped by our kind of slice of history. Okay, so we want to talk about how this kind of works historically. So this is an interesting book. You know, I teach it in my Sociology of Youth class, which is SOC 377. It has no prerequisite. If you ever want to come take it, it's a fun class. I spent the last week talking about marriage. It's been fun. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Who knows? So this book, why is it interesting? Well, Postman writes this book back in 1979 with the idea of kind of giving us a history of childhood, and then his theory that television is going to undermine childhood. And he does a kind of really interesting bit of work in this book, where he basically takes us back, to essentially the Middle Ages is where his story starts, and the invention of the printing press in 1440. And what he says is prior to 1440, there really were no children in the way that we think of them. Why? There didn't need to be, right? Basically, you didn't need to learn how to read or write. And so basically at about age 7, 8, you were put to work either on your family farm or you were sent to apprentice in a trade, and you were part of the economy. But what happens in 1440 is you get the invention of the printing press. And it basically, makes reading really important. So in order to become an adult, right, and function in the economy, as time goes forward, you need to learn how to read. And so what we get is a category of people we call, children. And what are children? They are innocent, and they are protected from the needs of the adult world. Basically, they don't have to work because their job becomes essentially to become adults, right? To learn how to navigate in the adult world. So the idea of childhood emerged in the way that we think of it, right, in our kind of modern sense so it starts in 1440, but it probably takes until about 1900 for it to be fully formed. So it takes, a solid 460 years for it to fully form until it comes to kind of where we have it today. And even then, right, you can argue that we haven't done because, in some ways, childhood, if anything, keeps getting longer. So in 2011, I can't remember the guy's name, he coins the term emerging adult to describe all of you, basically people who are 19 to 29, who are not quite children, but you're also not quite adults because you haven't done any of the things like getting married, buying a house and all of that stuff that would have been normal for people, your age a couple centuries ago. So our categories of kind of parts of life are constantly changing. We don't really get the word adolescent. So people don't really think about, adolescence as being a separate category of people until really late, sometime around 1870. And the word teenager doesn't actually get used until it's used in the New York Times in 1957. So our categories of like who fits into what categories, like what the life course and the progression through the life course looks like, is constantly changing as it adjusts to social norms. And today, we're going to think of young adults as a different category than older adults, specifically because all of you are going to be in school for a while and sort of trying to establish yourselves well into your late 20s. So we think of you in kind of different terms. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay. I keep meaning to redo this slide because this one should be earlier. I'll fix that in a sec. Okay, hang on a sec. So we talk in sociology, one of the things we talk about typically when we talk about different groups and the way that we want to talk about how the slice of history that you experience, especially as a young person, how it affected you. We split people into a couple of different groups. So one of these is age cohorts, right? And this is the simplest one where you're going to basically be like, okay, people born between this year and this year, or that are this old and this old, are an age cohort. Sometimes we talk about people in terms of age roles, right? So I was just doing that a second ago, right? We could talk about, children, adolescents, emerging adults, and then adults or older adults, seniors, whatever, right? We can split people into kind of age roles. But one of the really common ones that's become really common, probably in the last 30, well, maybe 25 years, is talking about people in terms of generational cohorts. I guess you could take it back even to the 1960s. Okay, so when we talk about generational cohorts, these are kind of really common ones that people have talked about in Canada, right? So the greatest generation, and almost all of, there's very few of these left, right? People born 1901 to 1928, kind of people who came of age or were born around the time of the Great Depression and fought in World War I, right? So the youngest of these are now going to be pushing 100. So there's not very many left. So we often don't talk about them because they don't exist in appreciable numbers. The silent generation, those born from 29 up to 1945. Now they're dying, but if you want a prominent member of this generation, Joe Biden, was a silent. Also, the only member of the silent generation to ever be president of the United States for some reason. It went from greatest generation to baby boomers, and it skipped over the silents until it kind of went back for Biden. So the silent generation, born, the late 20s to the mid 1940s, sometimes also called the traditionalist or lucky generation. But probably the most consequential one, and the one that has been the most important probably since the 1960s, have been this group called the baby boomers. And some of these dates, right, these are what was in the textbook. I sometimes quibble with these dates a little bit. I think 1965 is too late. I always put the end of the boomers at about 1962. But I mean, you're not going to be tested on that, and that's neither here nor there. So this is the generation born kind of after the war, and till the early part of the 1960s. So it is, for one thing, the largest demographic that we have still. They're a massive group. And just to put it in kind of reference, in the United States, out of a population at the time, I think of about 121 million, there were 76 million children born between 1946 and 1962. In Canada, out of a population of, I think it was about 12.1 million, there were something like 8.1 million babies born, right? So it's a huge demographic kind of bubble. So, I mean, if you want to put this in context, during the baby boom, more people were born in the United States than currently live in France. I don't know how impressive that is. So they've been a hugely consequential generation, and we define them typically by a couple of their experiences, right? So they grew up very much during kind of in the U.S. the Vietnam era, in Canada the Trudeau era, and Canada's centenary. They were the people who enjoyed a lot of the popular music that was definitive in the 60s and 70s. People like the Beatles. They're probably the first generation that really saw the benefits of feminism. And one of the, and the last generation, especially in the US, for whom there was the draft, right? Mandatory military service. Okay, the boomers, a very consequential generation. Gen X, which again, I always put the end of Gen X about 1979, because I like it slightly rounder, and then I put the beginning of the millennials at 1980. And I keep meaning to change these slides, and I always forget. So, Gen X, a generation that's often kind of talked about in terms of being really negative. they're the generation that grew up kind of in the period of the, bless you, post-1970s economic crash. So they were a generation that struggled financially. They're the last generation that grew up entirely before the internet, which is interesting. So they're the last analog generation. And in some ways, the last generation, that were left alone by their parents, left to roam outside. Okay. Millennials, or the best generation, as I like to call them. You can guess what generational cohort I'm part of. Roughly 1980, and here, early 2000s is not right. 1995 is the millennials. The first generation, really to experience the internet in childhood, right? The internet becomes kind of commercially available in about 1995, 1996. So often referred to kind of as digital natives. If you count them, to include the early 2000s and 2016 in the US, they surpassed the boomers to become the largest living generation. If you cut it off in 1995, they're still not. And this is a generation that grows up during a time of increased education and increased ethnic diversity. Okay, there's now, two other generations we can talk about, but I don't have them on the slides, and I should. Your generation, or the generation that most of you are part of today, I love my pen with an eraser on it, is Gen Z, right, or Gen Z. A generation marked by, essentially having had smartphones. I was going to say iPhones, but smartphones for your whole life, and lots of arguments that you are the anxious generation. So you laugh. I heard someone laugh. But this is actually the title of a book from last year by Jonathan Haidt. Jonathan Haidt. And there's pretty good evidence from both Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge that Gen Z, is a generation marked by a lot of anxiety, depression, and increased risks of things like, suicidal ideation, self-harm. Now, Haidt and Twenge thinks this is because of smartphones and because, you never go outside and interact with things in the real world. But there's some debate about that. And then, a generation whose name I truly hate, Gen Z, I put as 1996 to about 2010, 2012 at the outside. My children fight about this, by the way, because my children, my oldest and my middle child, my daughter is born in 2010, and my son is born in 2012. And my daughter is firmly convinced that her brother is the scum of the earth, and that he has engaged in all of the worst slang in the world, so that she is clearly part of Gen Z, and he is, what they're calling Gen Alpha. Some people are calling Gen Alpha, which, by the way, is a really terrible name, and we need to pick a better one. Which would be like 2010 to roughly the present. Or I guess 2011 to the present. So my daughter's like, well, I'm Gen Z and he's Gen Alpha. And I'm like, seriously, there's 2 years between the two of you. And you talking obnoxious slang too. And that's no cap. See what I did there? I think I even used that correctly. Though I'm never quite certain. And I'm told that when I do so, it is in fact cringe. Getting old sucks. You lose all the lingo. Okay. So why do we talk about these generational cohorts? Because those formative experiences you have when you're young really bond you to people that are roughly the same age. You all grow up through the same kind of things. And so you have a lot more in common with people who are your kind of co-generationists than people from different generations. And weirdly, because I'm born right in 1982, I'm in a kind of weird spot where I feel like I have more in common with Gen X than I do with the younger millennials. But that's neither here nor there. Like some of our grad students in the department are born right at the end of the millennial cohort, and I'm like, man, you guys seem like kids to me, and that makes me feel super old. Okay. So, Humans, we're continuously surrounded, and influenced by real or imagined others, right? So both real people and people, kind of imagined, generalized others that you kind of think are there, right? I don't want to say it's like mismanners, but sometimes you're going to, act politely in a circumstance where you have no reason to act politely because you know it's the right thing to do, and some generalized other, might judge you for it if they caught you, right? And this constitutes our social environment. All the people around us, our society, right? All of those norms constitute our social environment. My watch thinks I'm stressed out. It's like, you should take 5 deep breaths. I'm like, I have no time for that. Okay. So, adaptation from a social perspective, from the perspective of socialization, slightly different than biological adaptation, is, involves you as an individual kind of arranging what you do to get the best out of your environment so that it satisfies your needs, right? So, you might think that I am a giant, huge jerk for the questions that I asked on the midterm, right? You might be like, those were unfair questions, and you lulled us into a false sense of security by your easygoing style. And you lied to us. Now, it's unlikely, however, that you're going to write me an email with if you put an address at all, you will be doing better than some of my students. But you're not going to be like, Dear Professor Jerkface, right? You're going to be like, Dear Professor Broussard, I have been enjoying your class so far. I have learned so much about myself and the society that I live in, blah, blah, blah. So this is my least favorite thing about emails sometimes, is the flattery. So with me, just be warned, you can skip the flattery. I get these letters or these emails where people are asking for letters of recommendation. They're like, your class, Sociology of Youth, taught me so much, and it has become core to my belief. I'm like, shut up. No, it hasn't. Like, no one believes that. Come on. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, right? But you're going to arrange your actions to gain your environment's cooperation, right? You want something from me. Oops, sorry. Maybe you want me to raise your grade or something, right? So you're going to, set up your actions in such a way as to get something out of me, right? And you do this all the time, right? You do this, if you think that the barista at Starbucks is really cute and you want to date them, right? You present yourselves in a particular way to that barista. This is how you, gain things from the environment that you want, right? Your needs and interests. You arrange your social actions and you learn these actions from other people. Okay, now socialization. Things that you need to know. So it's ongoing. As I've said before, from a sociological perspective, you're never done being socialized, right? You're always learning things from your environment and you're always adapting. Okay, so in any environment, a person acts on the basis of his or her existing personal characteristics and interests. So, people have limits. I guess it's important to say, right? Some people are charming and witty. Other people are, I'm not talking about myself, no. Other people are rude and maybe, boorish in some way, and they're going to continue to act like that, right? So people act in any environment on the basis of their existing kind of personal characteristics, right? How they are. And then what happens? Well, the environment responds, right? So, you come up to me and you try to charm me after class so that you can get some extra grades, and I'm going to respond in some way. Either I'm going to be like, oh yeah, let's review, and maybe I throw you some extra grades. Don't get your hopes up. This is just an example. Or maybe I'm like, oh, I'm really sorry, I can't help you. Or you come up and yell at me that you think something was super unfair. That's happened before a few times. And then I respond by calling security. No, I'm kidding. I respond, right? It's this kind of back and forth. And that shapes your individual conduct, either by reinforcing your existing pattern. Okay, let me tell you a story. My mother-in-law. All good stories start with my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law is an extraordinarily rude person. And I'm not just saying that because she's my mother-in-law. So she goes to stores and she's really mean to the customer service staff in general, right? So because she wants something, like she wants a discount, or she wants them to return an item that she bought 6 years ago at Costco and now it's broken because what the hell lasts 6 years anymore? And she'll be extraordinarily rude to the customer service staff, right? So this is her, right? On the basis of the fact that she's kind of a rude and abrupt person. Now, what's happened over time is that she gets what she wants, right? Because, she'll argue with the customer service rep, and that person's like, no, I can't help you. We don't even carry this thing anymore. Your receipt is from 6 years ago. And then they call the manager, and the manager's like, oh, as a valued Costco customer, or wherever the hell she goes. She's done this in so many places. It's mortifying. I like to send my wife with her because my wife wants to crawl under a table and die when my mother-in-law does this. So I try to force her to go as much as possible. Not because I'm trying to create a rift between my wife and my mother-in-law, but because I'm trying to create a rift between my wife and mother-in-law. What did I say? I don't know. But the thing is that she's gotten what she wants so often, right, by being rude to customer service staff, that it's reinforced these existing patterns. Because she's gotten the cooperation of her environment by being super rude. Now, I've worked in customer service too many times, and I will say I am like overly polite to customer service staff, and I also get pretty good results. People are generally pretty helpful. So I usually get cooperation. But sometimes, let's say my mother-in-law could change, debatable. If she got resistance at stores, right, she might change her approach and become just the sweetest person ever. I mean, anything's possible, right? So that's kind of how it works, right? You go out on the basis of your characteristics. You try something in the environment, and depending on how the environment responds, either it reinforces that pattern of your social behavior, being rude and boorish to service staff, or when it doesn't work, right, you have to change and you approach things differently. Okay. Oh, this is interesting. Okay. In my opinion, what sort of things separate Gen Z from Gen Alpha? Like early Gen Z were the last gen maybe not to have cell phones. So, I mean, it depends. So, okay, hang on. I'm going to answer these questions out of order. So, how do you draw the calendar boundaries between these generations and contest them? Is it not objective? So here's the problem. It's really not, right? And this is kind of constantly shifting. And that's why, like, for me, right, I'm born right at the beginning of the millennial generation, kind of towards the end of Gen X. And so sometimes people call the people born in the early 1980s Zennials, right? So a kind of mix between millennials and Gen X. Why? Because there's some blurring between these lines. So the dates aren't objective. Basically, when people are drawing these boundaries, they're like, okay, can we take people in kind of general age ranges or year ranges and say these people probably shared a lot of formative experiences. They were X, number of years old, mostly when this kind of technology hit or whatever it happens to be. But the reason these numbers are a little bit squishy and, 3 different people will have 3 different dates is because, there's nothing really objective about it. It's not like, in 1996, everybody starts to be born with a little Z mark on them. And so it's like, oh, this must be a new generation, right? This isn't the millennials anymore, now it's Gen Z. It's quite, it's just something we're kind of looking at like social characteristics. Okay, so it's not really objective. Your mom, what happened to Gen Y? Your mom was born in 1975 and always said she was part of Gen Y, but they disappeared. So here's the funny thing. So Gen X, for whatever reason, that's a name that really caught on. And then as, it got clear that people being born kind of the late 1970s, early 1980s were a little bit different from Gen X, they tried to figure out a better, like a new name for this cohort. And because I guess Y is after X, they were like, okay, that's Gen Y. But for whatever reason, as time went on, the name millennial sort of caught on. And so Gen Y really is the millennials, right? That's who they are. I think from most of the date ranges that I've seen, your mom would be Gen X, right? She's definitely kind of late Gen X, but she would be Gen X or a very, very early millennial. But yeah, Gen Y was a term that was being used, and then it stopped being used and was replaced with millennial. And, Gen Z, I didn't think Gen Z was going to stick because, Gen Y didn't stick, but it looks like Gen Z is kind of sticking. So that's always interesting. It may change. Jean Twenge was advocating for iGen, like iPhone, but that one didn't catch on. Okay. All right. Will you be able to try and debate some of the questions, like how much of a percentage increase is it possible to get? Okay, so I'm not giving half marks on multiple choice questions because that is slightly crazy making. But if there's a bad question, so here's why you should come and review your exam potentially, because it not only can help you, but it will help everybody. If there's a bad question, I'll regrade it, right? And here's the other thing I'll say. I will never, ever, ever, ever reduce your grade. I'm not going to be like, oh, well, I give you an extra grade here, but technically this question, I'll never reduce your grade because I'm not like that. But you might increase the grade for the whole class if we find a bad question, right? And there sometimes are bad questions. There is one that snuck in there that I already regraded. That one you won't count. Everybody already got a mark for it that had that question. That was a bad question. I already regraded that one. But we can regrade and boost it by 2% because every question is worth 2%, right? Okay. I have no idea. I think it's just catchy. Like Gen Z is just kind of catchy. Gen Y doesn't really roll off the tongue, but Gen Z does, right? Like, I don't know. I think that's why it stuck. And Gen X was pretty catchy. Is the next generation called Gen Alpha, called Gen Beta? I really hope not. I think we need better naming conventions. I keep saying that Gen Alpha actually should be called Gen Fortnite because my son just never gets off that stupid game. And he's like, my God, I must play more Fortnite. I'm like, it's a playable ad. It's a commercial that you pay to play, basically. Okay. In my opinion, what sort of things separate Gen Z and Gen Alpha? Like early Gen Z were the last gen. Yeah, I mean, early Gen Z probably, would have been about 10 when the first smartphones came out, right? I guess a little bit less, 1996, so 9 years old when the first iPhone came out. I know there were Blackberries before that, but who cares? Nobody liked them. So that's the big distinction, right? Most of them don't, except the very oldest of Gen Z, don't remember a world without smartphones, right? I think that's the big difference with Gen Z. And pervasive internet, right? Millennials had the internet, but you had to sit down at a big stupid computer that was plugged into a wall to go on the internet. For Gen Z, it's pervasive. It's everywhere, right? It's in your pocket all the time. Well, you need to know how to describe each generation. Okay, so here's the kind of question you might get on a generation. It's like, I'm going to give you a list of things, right? Like a list of attributes. Like John, is addicted to his smartphone. He plays Fortnite constantly. He gets anxious if he's away from his notifications for 5 minutes. What generation is John likely a member of, right? And then I'll give you a list of generations. Right, so we could give you a few of these. So I hope that helps. But I won't, it's not going to be, there's not like written questions where you have to, will there be a written section on the next midterm or final? No, it's the same. 50 multiple choice questions. And it's non-cumulative, just to say things again that I've said 100 times before you even ask. Clear. Will we be able to, I answered this, right? Yes. You can debate questions, that's fine. I mean, it has to be good. Just because you debate something, it doesn't mean I'm going to give it to you. But if you make a good case and the question's bad, I mean, that happens, right? Okay. Did I skip over anything? No. Okay. How are we doing for I really do wish there was a clock in here. Okay, 110. And we've got 12 slides, but a couple of question slides. All right, let's keep going. There's some fun ones coming up. Okay. So our functionalists, right? So let's go back to our main schools of sociology, right? You know, functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, right? Oh, sorry. No, what am I trying to write? Symbolic interactionism. Sorry, it's one of those things. You get me after my other class where I do that one first for an hour and a half, and you don't always get the best of me. Okay, so, but you do get fun stories about my mother-in-law, which my other classes never get. Okay, so functionalists, right? So again, what do we know about our functionalists? Like when we're thinking about functionalism as a school of sociology. So, it is always interested in social equilibrium, right? And the proper function of social institutions. And really worried about whether social institutions are working well, right? Okay, whether they're functional or dysfunctional. Okay, sorry, I said okay like 5 times there. I'm really sorry. So what do functionalists say about socialization? Well, socialization for functionalists. I promise this is not the only class that I can't talk in. In my class, Intro to Social Methods yesterday, I had a complete mental breakdown and I had to start speaking Russian for 30 seconds to reset my brain back into English. I was just like, okay, I'm gonna speak Russian for 30 seconds because I cannot speak English right now. And once I'd done that, everything was fine. So, okay, functionalists, right? Basically what they're interested in when they talk about socialization is how socialization is used to maintain orderly social relations, right? So things like you're socialized to treat certain people with respect, right? So parents, at least in theory, teachers, professors, police officers, at least in theory. I've said some bad words at police officers, I won't lie. Anyway, maybe my socialization failed and fell into dysfunction. But teaching us how to operate in the world is about kind of keeping society functioning well, right? We all know how to interact with each other. We all know what politeness is. We all know how to behave, when to behave in certain ways, right? You know that, hopefully, that the lecture hall and the bar are different places, right? And behavior like hooting and hollering and screaming, yeah, would be appropriate at a bar during a hockey game, but not appropriate during a lecture when you heard a really salient and interesting insight from a professor. So, right, it keeps orderly social relations. You know, we know what to do in certain spaces. And you were taught how to act in this room by, starting with your kindergarten teacher or your preschool teacher, right? You were like, Miss Kerbopple, Miss Kerbopple, Miss Kerbopple, my cat Mittens has, 9 kittens. And Miss Kerbopple, that's the teacher from The Simpsons, by the way, was like, no, little Johnny, be quiet. You have to wait your turn. You have to raise your hand, right? You have to be quiet in a classroom and all of these sorts of things. So you've been socialized for years to get to this point where you're, so wonderful and sitting quietly listening to me talk. So for functionalists, all our socialization keeps our relations orderly, right? It keeps society functioning well. Okay, so conflict theory. I guess I could just erase all of my marks on the slide, but this is more fun. Let's go with a different color for conflict theory. Green, because green is the color of conflict. So conflict theory and feminists typically look at things like socialization, and what do they stress? They stress that often socialization is meant to keep you in line, right? To teach you the norms, and especially under certain schools of conflict theory, these are the norms that oppress you. And a lot of times, what they want to do then is sort of break down a lot of those norms. So let's say for feminists, right? Feminists have long argued that the way girls are socialized from very young has been, in such a way as to kind of socialize them to be passive, right, rather than active, to prize emotion, and to essentially make them believe that the normal way of being female is to be nurturing, right, to nurture people. And that these are the very norms that have sought to oppress women, right? That have sought to keep them down, to present, men who are socialized differently as the, reasonable, active, powerful, the ones who are leaders, and all of these things. So feminists have pointed to socialization as one of the tools of oppression for women, right? And same thing with conflict theorists, right? If you think of like social class, or even race, they will emphasize that, in class, people are taught to know their place in society, to behave in certain ways, to be deferential to authority, especially the authority of the rich. And for race, right, so people are socialized to prize certain racial characteristics as better than others, certain races as superior, and all of these sorts of things, right? So you see this in like critical race theory and such things. Okay, so this is, how, again, I'm doing this in short form. It's a lot more complex than that, but kind of basics. All right, purple. I'm going with purple. Symbolic interactionists, because they're kind of wacky, they deserve purple. Highlight the creativity of individuals in attaching meaning to their social surroundings. So symbolic interactionists, will look at socialization as part of the process that shapes you, but also your ability to resist it, go against it, to make new social norms, to recreate society in lots of ways based on how you react to it. So symbolic interactionists, right? Always the thing we should remember. And the sub-school, which is social constructionism, right? This is the sub-school of symbolic interactionism. Always there's this sense of like, yes, you are being shaped by society, but you also are shaping society through your own actions and the way you respond to social norms. So it's always a kind of, Ouroboros. Socialization is an Ouroboros. A snake eating its tail, right? It's a circular process where you're shaped by the society you're in, but you also get to shape it in major ways, and then it shapes you again, and you shape it, and it kind of goes on and on. Okay. I just want to go back. No questions. Perfect. So, families. When it comes to socialization, right, families are the most important agents. Why? Well, I mean, it's sort of a first mover problem in this case. We call them the locus or the agents of primary socialization because, your family is where you learn first, right? Before there are any other influences like friends or school or peers, there's mom, dad, brother, sisters, grandma, grandpa, cousins, all that jazz, right? So families are super important in every school of sociology, right? They're considered that primary place where people are socialized. And yeah, the family into which you are born exerts an enduring influence over you as your life goes forward. So you know how they say, and this is a terrifying thought, that you eventually become your parents? As someone now, I guess, firmly ensconced in middle age, I can say I'm definitely becoming my parents, and I'm not happy about it. But, I mean, my parents are great in some ways. But also, their continuing influence on me is notable. Particularly my dad. Anytime my dad would do a construction project, and something would go wrong, he swears like an absolute sailor. And the funny thing is, I do exactly the same thing. Not only that, I use exactly the same swears as he used when I was growing up. So, when we build stuff together, it's quite hilarious. It's just a unending string of curses. I'm bad at building stuff, so I curse a lot. Okay, that's why I'm a professor and not a handyman. Trust me, you don't want me trying to fix anything at your house. Okay, so families exert a lot of influence, culturally, socially. You never quite escape your family of origin. Okay, schools. Schools are our next major one. And these would be our sites of secondary socialization, which I'll highlight. So after family, right, the place where you are going to spend the most of your time is in school. Therefore, school is a really important place that your understanding of the world and how you navigate is formed. Now, there's a couple of different ways that schools form us, right? Because there's nope, I don't want my highlighter pen. There's two ways that schools form us. One is peers, because you meet friends in school and you interact with them a lot. And there's way more of your peers than there are teachers. But of course, a big one is teachers as well. So peers and teachers are what happens in schools, right? And they're socializing you. Why does my son talk like a YouTube video? Because he's been socialized at school with all of the, kind of Gen Z, Gen Alpha lingo, that something is cap, that saying yes is, you say bet. I still don't understand that one. Maybe I never will. And all the lingo. Bet, I hate bet. I hate it a lot. But whatever, I'm sure my parents also hated the slang we used as kids, just that ours was correct. So, so you're socialized by your peers, and you're socialized obviously by teachers, because they're the kind of governing authority and they're governing your behavior, what's considered right, wrong, appropriate, inappropriate. Okay, so let me erase this for a moment. Or actually, I'm going to erase it forever, but then I'm going to write something else. Another aspect that a lot of people, especially conflict scholars, so conflict theory, have suggested is that school is also a site of what's sometimes called the hidden curriculum, right? Where basically, certain things are enforced as good and bad through the curriculum, even though it's not explicitly stated. So if you've ever heard kind of complaints, and maybe you have, maybe you haven't, that, the study of English is composed of, dead white men. This has been an argument about, so this argument mostly comes from people like critical race scholars like Daniel Bell, who basically argue that by prizing people like Shakespeare, and Dickens, you're, instead of sort of black authors, female authors, you are essentially setting up the idea that, good literature is stuff written by dead white men. It hurts me a little, being that I'm an aficionado of Shakespeare. By the way, the Citadel is putting on a show called A Midsummer Night's Dream, the 70s musical, which I think you should all go see because it sounds fabulous. The tickets are a little expensive, but I think it'll be well worth it. Because, I don't know, mixing 70s musical with A Midsummer Night's Dream just sounds great. Okay. Anyway, bless you. So, students from minorities, women, right, are often seen as being oppressed by this secondary socialization that sort of sneaks in under the guise of, the curriculum, right? A lot of assumptions built into the curriculum that shape people's experiences, right? So let's say even in the teaching of history, by starting Canadian history, right, with the arrival of, Cartier, or in the case of the United States with kind of the Pilgrims or Columbus, that you're essentially saying that the only important history is the history of the white Europeans who landed here rather than, indigenous people, by not talking about their history, right? That's part of the hidden curriculum, saying essentially, that those folks don't matter. It's all just, Europeans, right? The settlers who came. that were the important ones. This is the hidden curriculum, and often, right, it's suggested that the hidden curriculum marginalizes students from those groups by essentially showing them that their histories, their meanings, and all of that stuff isn't important. Okay. Just want to... Do you think factors like having siblings, being oldest, youngest, actually affects what kind of person you become? Okay, bet is shortening, you bet. I still hate it. Okay, bet, because... Okay, now that you've given me two different definitions of bet, and I don't know which one is true. Okay, do I think having siblings being oldest and youngest actually affects what kind of person you are? Oh, definitely. So there's a ton of psychological studies, and me and psychology, we're besties. I love it. I don't. But there's a ton of psychological studies that show that there's very definitive traits that come from being, oldest, middle, youngest, and anything in between, right? First, second, third. Maybe that's why my sister is such a terrible person. She's older than me, and second children are best. I don't know. That's a theory. No, I'm kidding. My sister's great at some things. But yeah, there's definitely strong effects, and that probably has to do with socialization. If my son is any indication, being constantly berated by an older sibling for being less capable than someone 3.5 years older than you has really affected his self-esteem. So that's probably one. What I say the determinist factor and one experiences while growing up are absolute deciders on how someone will behave later on. No, I do not believe that. Because I am at heart kind of a social constructionist in some ways. I do think that people have agency, and I know people who've overcome childhood traumas and crappy families, to change things in very big ways. Now that said, it's not easy, and more people just kind of continue on the patterns they learned in childhood. But I don't think it's determinative. I think it's strongly influencing. So the hidden curriculum is a latent function. That is a great way of putting it. We're going to say it's just a factor that explains why some... I'm going to say that was related to the older sibling question, or the other one. I can't tell, but yes to both. Okay, does lower? I understood what this meant. Does lower self? Oh, well, that's not helpful. How can both definitions be correct? Does lower self-esteem relate to school hidden curriculum? Students who don't fit in to the mold are best left behind with certain skills like socialization. That's certainly been the argument from, say, critical race scholars, is that the hidden curriculum, and feminist scholars as well, that the hidden curriculum disadvantages certain people, right? Will lower their self-esteem. Leonard Sachs makes an interesting argument about this in a book called Why Gender Matters. And he's talking about the teaching of things like physics in school. And one of the things, I always found it interesting, and I never really followed up to see if anyone had implemented it, but it always sounded like a provocative idea to me, and I like provocative ideas. And he basically suggested that, girls and boys should be taught physics differently. Because boys and girls, he suggests, have inherently different sort of interests, but the way that physics has frequently been taught to boys frequently been taught is one that kind of prizes kind of male interests. Something like two race cars are driving towards each other at, 90 miles an hour, blah, blah, blah. Or two football players collide going X speed, which one what is the force created? And he advocated things like, teaching girls physics through things like Fibonacci sequences, which I'm sure we all know what that is. I'm going to pretend I remember what a Fibonacci sequence is. I remember learning about it, but I couldn't define it for you now. But it's something that girls inherently seem to find more interesting rather than, two football players running into each other. And that's a kind of example of being like, the hidden curriculum says physics is male because all the examples are like things running into each other, especially at early stages, whereas other subjects are more female. He has similar things to say about English being taught often in a way that's not super engaging for males and much more engaging for females. Anyway, it's an interesting argument, and I think there's something to be said there. Okay, why do people reject the idea that the hidden curriculum is a thing? Additionally, why do people not want CRT taught in schools? I think CRT has been quite politicized. So, okay, this is, getting into people's psychology is hard, which is why I try not to do it. I think CRT got politicized. It came to be seen as something that one side in the political spectrum was advocating as a way of kind of, it doesn't help that some of the advocates of CRT, suggested things like the only remedy for past discrimination is present and future discrimination, which doesn't ring that true if you're the one that's going to be discriminated against in the present or future. So that stuff got politicized. I think people are would say that something like teaching Shakespeare is sort of value neutral. It's like Shakespeare's good because Shakespeare's good, right? It's well written, it's classic for a reason, rather than it's because someone wanted to be like, only dead white men are good writers. Can you go home early? I tried to send you home early last time and you yelled at me, so no. No, you didn't yell at me, but you were like, no, you'll never get through the curriculum. So no. You know what? You can leave at any time. And people have. Walk right by me and they're like, so you're free to leave at any time, and you can catch up later if you're feeling peaked. But she's holding me accountable, right? She's like, you got to get through the curriculum. Okay. I'm scared of her. Okay. So where was I? All right. Let's talk symbolic interactionism a little bit. 2 terms. Now these are going to seem very similar to you. They are slightly nuanced. So, the Thomas theorem. So, the Thomas theorem is, literally, situations, this is how it's listed by Thomas. The situations we define as real become real in their consequence, right? So, think of it this way, right? If you believe something about yourself, right, or about a situation, often you will bring that into being. Okay, so something like the Thomas theorem. Let's say, the night before the midterm, you're like, I'm really bad at sociology. I really am not going to do well on this exam. I just know it. I'm going to do really terrible. So instead of studying, you go out to the bar and you get completely blasted, right? You get blackout drunk and you wake up the next day just in time to make it to your exam, and you show up, you're completely hungover, and you do terrible on the exam, right? So you've defined, the situation. You're bad at sociology, and then you basically kind of act in such a way as if that's true. So you don't study, you get I'm obviously creating a very extreme scenario. You get blackout drunk, you eat Kraft dinner for breakfast before coming to the exam, which can never be a good thing. Orange chemicals are not your friend, just like orange presidents. I'm not going to comment on my own joke there. So you bring about things that you believe, right? That's the Thomas theorem. So, very similar. So situations you define as real become real in their consequence, right? You act as if something is the truth, it becomes the truth for you, and because you take actions to bring that about, essentially it happens. Okay, so that's Thomas' theorem, right? So you define things as real, or let me see if I can think of another example. Something will come to me as I talk. I'll probably come back to this slide in a second. Okay, a self-fulfilling prophecy. So typically, especially when we talk about socialization, a self-fulfilling prophecy is typically, I'll tell you about, we talked about this experiment. No, we talked about this experiment in my Intro to Social Methods class. So there was this experiment done in social psychology. And basically, it's called the Spurters study. So what did they do in this study is they went to a school and they administered an IQ test to students. And then they reported fake results to the teacher, the teachers of different classes, right? So in some cases, they categorized students, regardless of their IQ. So they did a real IQ test, but they gave fake results as, basically gifted. They called them spurters, but saying spurters sounds weird. Gifters, gifted. And they told the teachers, hey, little Jenny is gifted, even though Jenny had an average IQ. And then what they did is they came back 8 months later and they gave Jenny another IQ test. And what they found was that basically the teachers had an expectation, right? So after being given this IQ test that said Jenny was gifted, the teacher had an expectation that Jenny could achieve great things, that she was smart. So what did they do? Well, the teachers then invested, right? They spent more time. They were like, Jenny's gifted. Why isn't she achieving at level? Well, let's spend more time teaching her to read and do math, and give her extra tutoring and all of that stuff. And lo and behold, what happened? 8 months later, Jenny's IQ went up, according to the test. Why? It's basically a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe someone is gifted, right, that expectation helps bring about what it sort of predicts, right? That someone can achieve great things academically. It's like, Jenny's gifted, so she can achieve great things academically. That's the prediction. And if you believe that, right, ultimately, you will take certain steps that ultimately bring that about, right? It helps to bring it about because you change your behavior to bring that thing about. Okay, I think that makes sense. Because Thomas, it was Thomas's theorem. That's why it's called the Thomas theorem. Why do people make judgments based on hair? Like blondes are dumb, redheads are fiery, brunettes are boring. My wife's a brunette. What are you saying? No. I've never heard the brunettes are boring one. That's an interesting one. I don't know. I guess on average, when you meet people, you make judgments, and maybe the average blonde you met was dumb, and then it becomes like a stereotype. But it's actually a really stupid thing. I mean, you're not wrong. I have a friend who works with a guy who's redheaded, and the guy has a fiery temper, and he calls them ginger explosions. So I don't know. He'll call me to complain about his friend Josh that had ginger explosion. Okay. So, how am I doing for time? I still got 12 minutes, and I can't stop. No, I'm just teasing you. I'm sorry. I'm being mean. So, peer groups, agents of socializations. Peer groups start to be really important, and they become more important somewhere around age 10 to 12, right? So, before age 10 to 12, your parents are probably the strongest influence on you. From somewhere around 10 to 12, peers start to become more important, right? So they help you, they help integrate young people into society, right? Because they acculture you to the norms of that particular generational cohort or that peer group that you're in. And peer groups, are generally, in sociology, people who are about the same age and a similar status as the individual, right? So same age, and usually same race, socioeconomic class, and other things, right? Often, sometimes religion. These would be your peers, typically. Okay, and status refers to the recognized social position that an individual occupies in a group. Now, why is status important? Well, because in lots of ways, I'm going to switch pen colors here to green. Can you see my green? Yes. When it comes to status is really important when it comes to peer groups, and especially when we talk about kids, because teens, I'll say teenagers because adolescence is too long to write, are super status oriented. They are status comparison machines. Always aware of, I'll do the Trump dance. Who's rising and who's falling in terms of social status. And status is actually just really important to human beings in general. There have been studies done where they looked at kind of how people evaluate relative status, especially as it regards beauty. So it was a really interesting experiment. They did it in France. I don't know why writing France is important. And they showed women pictures of either average women or like exceptionally skinny women. And they did it for 1/20th of a second. So too fast for you to actually perceive what the image was and process it. But what they said is the women who were shown like, skinny women or like models, 1 week later felt worse about their body image. And those who were shown average women felt better. Because your brain is always judging your status around things like physical appearance, beauty, social standing, possessions. We're doing this constantly, right? So, when you want a better car or some nicer clothes because you see other people around you have it, it's a very normal thing because you're reflecting on your status. Now, this can go horribly awry, especially when you have really rich friends. I have a few friends who I would categorize as really rich. I drive a Dodge Grand Caravan and they all drive like Audis, and one friend has a Lambo. And I'm like, my status meter says I suck. My wallet says I can't afford to buy those things. So professors do not make that much money, sadly. So, we're always worried about this. No matter how old you are, you always want the nicest things, and you're always worried about relative social status. Okay, I don't think I'm going to make it today, but I'm not going to stop yet either, so don't get too excited. Okay, we can do a couple more. Okay, so other agents of socialization, right? Not primary or secondary, but just other agents, the mass media, right? We get a lot of messages about what's important, what's valuable from media. And it used to be, things like, television, although television seems now to be much less important. But we're getting a lot of information, especially from social media. And from, I'm going to say, I know it technically is counted as social media, but I think YouTube. Well, why did you get laggy now, Pen? You've been great all day. Okay, YouTube, right? If my kids are any barometer, they love YouTube and YouTubers. So a lot of socialization comes through mass media. It's going to be a little bit different for any generation, but it helps us to know kind of, what's fashionable, what's cool, what's great, what we should aspire to, and all of these sorts of things. And it's not for nothing that if we look at Gen Z, the number one occupation that people want to do is the worst one. Influencer, right? Because they see high social status coming to influencers. So mass media plays a big role even in what you want to be in life, because it'll show you, say, what the best jobs are. Okay. Feminists have long complained about this, particularly that mass media has long been responsible for shaping women's image of themselves, right? So it shapes their attitudes, ideas, expectations, behaviors, especially things like beauty standards, right? So why do we, for example, why did, in the 2010s, women suddenly all want a big butt, right? And this was like massively across, kind of a whole bunch of metrics. Why did women want, larger posteriors that they could like prop up on the sink and take pictures of? It was because of the primacy of a group of evil dictators, the Kardashians. Right? Kim Kardashian, Kyle, I know like two of them. I'm sorry. I couldn't care less about the Kardashians. Much more interested in the Kardashians, but that's neither here nor there. That's some very obscure humor for you. Why? Well, why did girls and women suddenly start wanting to dress and look like Kardashians? Because they were bombarded with, Kim and Kylie and all those degenerates on Instagram, and whatever their reality show was. I can't remember what it was called. Keeping Up with the Kardashians, right? That's the one. I was going to say Welcome to Hell, but that isn't. That was my impression of it. Keeping Up with the Kardashians probably sells better than Welcome to Hell. Okay, so things like gender roles, beauty expectations, right? And feminists have long complained that the way that this is shaped through mass media, again, does things like, teach women that they are, objectifies them. My pen is quitting on me, or my laptop is. Okay. Do I have, it's so, I know you all have to go. It's just really weird when people just start walking out on you. You feel like you're doing something wrong. My socialization tells me that I've done something to offend people and they're just leaving. Okay, re-socialization. I'll do this one quickly. So re-socialization occurs when powerful socializing agents deliberately cause a rapid change in people's values, roles, self-conception, sometimes against their will. Okay, there's two big examples of institutions that tend to re-socialize people. One of them is prison, and one of them is a cult. Like the Kardashians. No, I'm kidding. So why? Okay, so and these are referred to as total institutions, but we'll talk about that in a second. Each of these places has a radically different set of values than the world outside, right? If you happen to have the great misfortune of being sent to prison, and as someone who's been involved in prison research, I genuinely hope that never happens to any of you. They're awful places. One of the things that happens very quickly is, you're cut off from all, your previous socializing agents. And the socializing agents are your fellow prisoners and the COs, right, the guards. And there are very specific values, hierarchies, and ways of being in this environment. And so what people have to do is very quickly adjust their own way of being to fit this environment, right? And so your values, your role, you had a role on the outside. Once you're in, you're something completely different, right? Your whole self-conception changes, right? You used to think you knew who you were. I guarantee you if you go to prison, that changes. And cults are the same, right? And they do it in the same way. They cut you off. They make you think all your friends and family suck and are trying to hurt you. And they put you in new roles, right? You are given a new role, a new identity. And sometimes, right, like what ends up happening in cults, a lot of people get a new name to shed your old name. So, right, a re-socialization to give you a whole new identity. Okay, I have 2 minutes. I don't think I can do initiation rites in 1 minute. So let's leave it there. That's a good place to stop. We'll finish up on socialization on Thursday, and then we're going to jump into deviance and crime as our next unit. So that should be a good time. Deviance and crime is really fun. And we'll talk about total institutions in deviance and crime. See you on Thursday.